So recently, George, one of the top performing players in Riftbound, released a tweet off the Substack about his feedback for Riftbound. I had the pleasure of meeting Houston, judging there. He's a nice guy. We're gonna give you the judge perspective, the player perspective, and deep dive onto his. To summarize, I do believe that what George has to say is accurate, and we are probably going to be entering Forge in a where it's probably not going the best. Let's dive into it. But first, we have a Discord about all things Riftbound links. George, in the beginning of his Substack, talks about his repertoire. He's someone who's on a regional in China and consistently top 8 in most of the tournaments, so he's pretty good. Now, the three main things to talk about is combat, deflect, power creep. Let's explain. So, his first major complaint is that in high level Riftbound, it feels like you're forced to fight as early as turn 2, and if your hand isn't good enough, you lose the spot. Which leads into his main point, which is sometimes combat tricks in hand are disproportionate to the amount of might that they give for the cost that they give. So, for example, he talks about how an opponent going first will place a 2-drop, move into Grove of a God Willow, and they will pass, and the player going second will place a 2-drop or a 3-drop going second and pass. The opponent going first will move the unit Grove of the God Willow, maybe place a 2 might unit down for another 2 cost with 2 runes up, potentially having combat tricks. And if they move the unit into Grove of the God Willow, the player going second almost has to fight them there and then on the spot to get them off Grove, because if you don't get them off Grove, the opponent's just going to draw one every turn, every time. That becomes a problem because the player going second now has one of 3 options. Not good. Either one, they don't fight the unit and go to the opposite battlefield, seeding Grove and the draw a card for free. 2, they try to fight it through combat, use their combat tricks to get over them. If they win, best case scenario, it's a 1-for-1, 1 amp to their card that they lose. Worst case scenario, you lose your unit and you lose your spell because the opponent can play 1 or 2 amps that can get over you. Well, you will completely lose your 2 cards. Not only that, you lose tempo on point, tempo on board because you're unit, and you also lose. The third option is you kill it with a spell, which is net neutral, which may be bad or good. Now, what he talks about makes a lot of sense because in a lot of scenarios, Kaisen match goes first, plays portal or a block, they block with a portal into Grove. Up to me to deal with. Either I, as the Kaisa Hextech Great, put there and then spot on have the Hextech Great, great. If not, I'm in trouble. Or second is on my turn, I try to swing over them with, say, for example, a portal with a cleave giving 5 might. But if the opponent has a single amp, say, Unguard, Discipline, I'm in rough shape. Ideally, I'm able to kill the unit with spell, but that's kind of net neutral because I only trade 1-for-1, and usually still have to have 1 unit get a point to get a point. But because it's such a tempo-based game, it almost feels like you can't get over them through combat. You essentially lose the game, especially if the opponent card like Grove. Which leads into one of George's next deflect. Now, early on, Kai'Sa became quite strong because kind of people figured out that how do you deal with combat by not combat at all? You just kill the thing outright, no need to go combat and just move your unit. Same thing with Fatigue Victor. Now, the issue was that because of that, a lot of people got really good at Kai'Sa, and then deflect became one of the main ways to deal with Kiana, Deadbloom Predators, Stalwart Portals. Anything that had deflect essentially became a staple in the meta because if your deck was able to slot that in, you had a very good way to deal with spells that target cards. Because if your opponent can't get rid of your card there and then that had deflect, it was ultra punishing. A prime example was Deadbloom Predator. If your opponent had a Deadbloom Predator, you can either Hidden Blade it, which is okay, 2 power, 2 energy, get rid of a Deadbloom, can't deal with it. Call the Weak, which gets rid of it completely. But then there were times where you had to kind of kill it with stuff. Either Singularity plus a swing into it, or a Cathian Rain, or Falling Star. This was really bad because when the plays something with like it felt super terrible to be at because you had to swing over with combat to deal with deflect efficiently, but that led to the first issue of having amps in hand. Because if there was a Dead Bloom Predator, say for example, sitting on a battlefield, Master Yi, plus 10 on, my only way to deal with it as a Kaisa is either Thousand Tail, swing in, raid, Darius Cleave, which is also just net neutral. Or I try to play a Falling Star on Dead Bloom, pay double deflect and smoke screen, 3 deflects, or play Falling Star, double deflect, and then Thousand Tail to get rid of Dead Bloom Predator. However, the opponent could easily just have an Unguard or Discipline to amp it out of range. Once again, you'd be in a rough shape. He talks about how deflect just is such a polarizing keyword, which basically functions says that if this unit has deflect, your opponent essentially cannot target this with a spell, because if your opponent does try to target with a spell, unless it's a turn that you win the game outright, the cost of paying that deflect is just so immense because it sets your game plan back, whereas it just gives your opponent just free value because there's honestly nothing that they can with it. Now, this goes on to his third point, technically, which is beyond adjusting might. There's quite a few cards, especially in purple, that for the cost of 2 might, essentially just either negates combat or wins it. Because of the rise of Annie, there were a lot of cards and situations where Annie with Ride the Wind felt so painful. If you try to swung over an Annie card, say for example you're trying to kill a sneaky deckhand or kill a Kaisa, you would move enough might into it. What would happen is your opponent can then play a card like say Ride the Wind, move it to the opposite battlefield. You would gain a point, but they would also not only gain a point off their conquer, they would gain a point off their hold, and you probably committed a card and an amp typically to get over their board. This kind of felt really bad because just a lot of cards that just essentially say for the cost of 1 energy or 2 energy, I can essentially negate all the cards you've played. Say, for example, Fight or Flight, Ride the Duke. Basically, say no to combat, and as a result, you lose all the reasons you did play. It doesn't matter if your opponent loses 2 energy with Rebuke. Such a strong card because there's nothing that you can do. Big body, gone. Big might, gone. A swing big enough to kill you, I'm gonna run away with Ride the Wind. One of the situations where it felt like no, because you're put in a tough spot. Either you play around fight or flight rebuke by, like I said before, killing your opponent's things at a battlefield, not giving them a chance to react with these things. And even then, it still felt bad because cards like Fight or Flight can still save units. Because if I try to Void Seeker a unit at a battlefield with Fight or Flight, your opponent can easily just play Fight or Flight, move the units away, and there is essentially nothing that you can do to deal with it. It just kind of felt really bad. But one of the more bigger complaints that he did have was 3 cards and the power system. He's talking about how the Sonya's should be a more expensive card because the fact that you can choose to reanimate anything is kind of a problem, and the fact that you can hide the card at a battlefield for 1 hour, and then essentially you can anything you can save for free. Reveals Sonya's was super busted because I'm super annoying end combination at 1. Master Yi, Dead Bloom Predator, kill a unit, they tap out, and then hide a Zonya power class underneath the battlefield of Dead Bloom Predator. So not only did you have to deal with Dead Bloom Predator first, you also knew that they could bring it back with Zonya's. You have to get over it again because they had deflect. You always had to get over with combat, but because Dead Bloom Predator on a battlefield is a 10, which is really strong, it just seemed impossible to deal with because you would just essentially die on the spot because you couldn't out resource them with that. Dazzling Aurora, I kind of see where he's coming from. Dazzling Aurora is a really hard because it's a 9 might or 9 cost card that essentially prints out 8, 9, 10 might units, which is understandably fair. But I will say Dazzling Aurora has its counters, got gear breaks, and it's kind of high rolly. Dazzling Aurora can win and it can make top 8, but you're kind of playing a casino game within a casino game because not only do you need to high roll to get your dazzling on the curve, you also have cards like Rebuke, Fight or Flight, Call of the Week, Hidden Blade, which completely puts dazzling in rough shape. So it's not like it's a deck that had like no counters to it. It was just specifically against Kaisa, which was gorgeous me. It did exceptional as well. I think Dazzling Aurora set, but I think it's still like pretty fair and well balanced. But I understand what he's talking about because now you can't print cards that are too strong in Dazzling Aurora decks because if you print them too strong, you're just cheat out things that are a little bit too insane. Miracle. Now, Miracle decks are fun. They're strong. We've seen Draven Miracle. We're probably going to see Sivir Miracle, Ezreal Miracle. Basically, anything with Ezreal, Rosses, and Battering Rams, you're probably going to see iterations of Miracles there. The only issue with that is just kind of power creep time because you're going to be able to put a lot of power out on board pretty easily, pretty quickly. However, this feels more like a combo deck and Exodia-ish deck. Have it, you have it. If you don't, you don't. It is the opponent kind of playing solitaire on their own, but it's just one of those situations where if you can deal with it, you shape it. If you can't deal with it, ooh, probably in rough shape. So Miracle might be a problem in the future, but after having tested quite a few decks, I'm just gonna say I'm pretty sure mid-range Draven just beats out Miracle 9 times out of 10. So Miracle just might be fake. Power system. The thing that he talks about is how by introducing gold, we've kind of made it so that power is no longer a cost because you're able to do it. And one of the issue is that it kind of feels like because of how gold replaces you having to recycle high power cards like Rebuke or Switcheroo, it just almost feels like because of the resource creep, it almost feels like it doesn't really matter that much that Rebuke might. It just makes it feel like, all right, I have gold, I can use gold to pay for Rebuke, I'm still ahead in runes, and my opponent also lost the uh, through Rebuke. So not only am I up on tempo, I'm up on resources, which is one way to be able to balance a card like Rebuke because the power was so high. Now, duds the price of playing fair. High stakes of early combat, especially going second, the proportionally powerful turn use and be often in costless cards. I think the biggest thing is that he's talking about how because you need to hit 2-drop turn 1 playing a normal deck dazzling. You don't hit your turn 1 drop, you're almost saying that you're losing the game there and then on the spot. There are situations where you still can come back going turn 2. However, it's just one of those situations. Either you make your deck weaker because of how important your 2-drops is by making your 2-drops weaker. Talking about how functionally, there are just some 2-drops that are a little bit too strong for their cost. A prime example is Poro, Deflect Poro. We also have a card like Overzealous Might 2 Body, which acts as a fight or flight, which is kind of insane. There are definitely some cards that have definitely felt the power creep, which is crazy. But it makes sense though that right now, that with how Riftbound Pro design right now, we're entering into a situation where you technically need to make 2 costs because of how strong they are early on, but it just doesn't curve out properly. So his suggestions is either you reduce the volatility of combat by making it so that combat tricks are absolute, they must have higher costs. So he's basically saying fight or flight, rebuke, ride the wind, can't be too. Reduce the stake of combat. Basically, mechanics like Grove of the God Willow, Draven, Purple Draven, makes it so that if you lose combat, it's ultra punishing. So he's basically saying don't print cards that basically make it so that if combat isn't won on the spot, you lose the game. Cards which solve combat absolutely against one creatures are too powerful to have the hidden. Makes sense. Fight or flight is Consider might restriction on all future rebukes. Basically saying more lenient gusts are okay, a lack of any line to fit which cards cost are current. Basically saying Gus has counterplay because you can always amp something out of Gus range, but cards like Rebuke are just too strong because it's almost an Omni negate. No way to deal with Rebuke except for, at least in the new set, Windwall, Not So Fast, Mystic Reversal. Those are kind of, and Hard Bargain. Those are kind of the few cards I can deal with Rebuke. But if your deck can't run that type of card, you're kind of left in a tough spot. Avoid overkill. Define Dance and not have to be punch first for less power and at reaction. That is kind of true. Punch first is kind of strong. Define Dance is also very, very, very strong. Because of how cheap it is, it makes combat right now a little bit too hard to deal with, which honestly kind of makes sense. Consider card designs which shift some combat might from hand to the board. Might should be primarily reside on creatures at least for to make, which I think makes a lot of sense. If there's one thing that is true, is that spells have more might than creatures have more might, which to me kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. The reason being is a card like, for example, Primal Roar, 4 energy plus 7 might. Right. There is no unit in the game that is 4 energy, 7 might flat out. The issue is that spells are just way more might efficient, which makes it so that you're better off playing a small body unit and amp out the wazoo with spells than it is to be able to play big units and just not play spells. It just almost seems like if you don't have spells, you're basically losing the game on the spot, which makes it so combat tricks are so important in the game. Long term, Ride the Wind must go, or scoring rules must. Ride the Wind, super problematic card. Any deck that can play Ride the Wind just puts your opponent in such a bad spot because you can run, you can hold. It does a lot of crazy things. Deflect and making damage spells work. The number of playable cards in the game functioning damage spells is far too high as a result of this parity target. Right now, deflect too painful, no way to deal with it properly. Deflect just basically makes it so that it's impossible to touch you unless you kill it, but because of the might through spells, you're gonna have a hard time killing it, which puts it in a tough spot. If none of these are available, you need to overkill stuff. Spells need to overkill stuff by like 100% to become tied into the might on hand versus board issue. Usually outside of set 1 Kaisa is already near. Talking about whole card arc. Spells essentially, if they don't do 150% damage, it's kind of in a bad spot. Void Seeker dealing 4 might worth damage for 3 runes isn't good enough. You essentially need to have Void Seeker deal 6 and draw a card for 3 runes to make it on par with a card like, say, Primal Strength. Give me an example. Essentially, to deal with the point disparity, prime example would be if an opponent has Unguard, which is a 1 card which does 1 amp for a unit if it's not alone, and 2 amp for a unit that's not alone, then you need to have a spell equivalent, which basically does the same thing. He's basically talking about how we need to have cards like Primal Strength, where it acts as a kill spell. So if you pay 4 energy, then you should be able to have a spell that does 7 damage, like Primal Roar. Right now, the closest thing to like 4 energy kill something is essentially either Vengeance, which technically kills something, or Void Seeker, which is 3 energy, 1 power, which does 4 damage, which makes a lot of sense. And then he also says, consider alternative to power creeping spells, perhaps Riftbound combat start design needs to target at resolution. Maybe more might buffs should be actions, which makes a lot of sense. Basically saying that buff should be more action based and less reaction based, because right now reaction buff cards is just too strong. If I try to play a spell, I can't kill it, the opponent is just gonna amp. Nothing I can do. The only time I can do something is if I play, say for example, Void Seeker first, kill the opponent, but if they have an amp, completely dead. But if I play a Void Seeker and the opponent wants to try to play uh, Punch first, they have to play that first in lieu of me trying to do that, which also makes a lot of sense. 3 cards and power cost. Not much to say here. This is mostly caused by outlier cards, which makes sense. It's important to look at the allocation of hidden keyword much more carefully. Yes, hidden is a fun mechanic. I think it's good, but it just makes it so that your opponent is able to cheat out resource tempo on strong cards, which they shouldn't be. Consider how gold is implemented, how it affects the budget allocation power. Yeah, 1 goal is equal to card on board edge of causes you gold. I don't gold balancing it. Hidden cards can be quite strong. There's not much this because we are in a tough spot. Improving 2-drop stack structure. Long term increase the might for drops 2 to 3 so they become irrelevant more quickly. Considering budgeting philosophy for 1 energy dead 2 drops and they'll come. Understand the idea here, but the description is great. Taper down the might top and the might of top end creatures. Give these small creatures powerful effect. Purple got some, so did yellow. We're budgeting far from equal. Combos and high rolls. Mulligan rules make creatures in general more powerful relative here. So, in summary, there's a lot of things that George talked about that make a lot of sense. There are cards that are too strong, too flexible, negates counterplay, and makes it so that 1 or maybe 2 archetypes are only playable. For the long-term health of the game, I would say that the best thing that Riftbound can do is honestly just have a restricted or banned list. Or just a restricted list, truth be told. I think right now, in order to deal with super strong cards, the only way and the best way to deal with it is to just make it so that you restrict how many copies of card can be played in a deck. For example, there's no way they're gonna errata ride the wind. Errata ride the wind so that the cost is 2 for like 3 energy, 4 energy. The only thing they can do is to restrict it by making it so that the deck can only 1 or 2 copies. That's probably what the game is going to do. Because I don't see a world, and I can't see a world where they have a card like Ride the Wind, cheap as it is, staying in the game because it just does a little bit too much overall. I think the balancing and the philosophy has, I think, in pretty good shape. I do like the power system, I like the energy. But I will say that there are definitely room for improvement to tweak. Battlefields like Grove that make it super combat specific. Don't print more of that. Not good. Or just ban it outright. Ride the Wind, limit it. Punch first, maybe limit it. Switcheroo, fight or flight, limit those. Like anything hidden, I believe that maybe only have a copy of, but even then there's ways to be play around stuff like that. So it's hard to say what the best way of it. I will say that going into Forge, the meta is gonna be one of 3 things, and it's gonna be tough to deal with. Number 1, Draven's gonna be the strongest deck. There's no doubt about it. Draven does not have any bad match. There is just no matchup that's bad against except for the Draven Mirror. Second, that's basically its bad matchup. 2, decks that counter Draven, which is not a lot. And 3, Dazzling Auroras. Those are going to be your main decks in the next set. Draven, decks that beat Draven, Dazzling Aurora. And those are going to be your 3 main archetypes. Don't get me wrong, there are going to be other decks that are going to pop up. They're going to be fun for a little while. For example, that technically Kaisa won the recent regional in China. Still don't know how they did it. Pretty sure Kaisa's fake. Ezreal, Fiora, strong decks, but hard to be able to compete with of Draven. And Dazzling Aurora, kind of in rough shape, but not going to stop people from playing Dazzling Aurora, because even now, Dazzling Aurora is still okay, but definitely a lot weaker. Overall, I think that Riftbound is going to be in a bit of a rough shape in the next set, because a lot of Dravens and a lot of cards that just amp out the Wazoo, and there's probably nothing that you can deal with. However, that's just my take and my opinion. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think about the state of Riftbound. Overall, I like the game. I like judging the game. I like playing the game. I like judging more than I do like playing or on my own. But overall, I think the game is okay spot. Set 1's probably the best set. Set 2 is going to make it. Going to enter in its power creep mode. And we're just going to have to deal with the meta where it's a lot of Dravens. Don't play Draven, you're probably not going to be. But that's just my take. Anyways, jump. Now, I'll see you guys later in the next video.